Racist man punches little black girl on an airplane. Navy SEAL sees everything and takes action. The jet bridge rattled with the sound of rolling suitcases, children tugging on parents' sleeves, and passengers shuffling forward with the same weary determination that came with a long morning of travel. Heat clung to the air outside the terminal, and the relief of stepping into the cabin was immediate. The flight from Atlanta to Seattle had every seat filled, families squeezed together, business travelers scrolling through emails, teenagers dragging oversized backpacks. The aisle grew tight as people reached up, pushing bags into overhead bins with impatient sighs. Flight attendants urged passengers to move along. Keep the walkway clear, please. Place smaller bags under your seat if possible. Their smiles were steady, practiced, though the strain of managing so many restless travelers showed in the tautness of their voices. Near the middle rows, a girl's laughter floated above the shuffle. Ebony Carter, no more than 7 years old, sat with her mother, Janice. Her braids were dotted with pink barrettes that clicked softly as she turned her head toward the window. Her voice, bright with excitement, carried easily. She spoke of mountains she couldn't wait to see and how she had never been so far from home before. Janice, gentle but firm, reminded her to use an inside voice, brushing her daughter's shoulder with the care of someone who wanted her child to feel both free and safe in an unfamiliar environment. Not everyone received Ebony's joy the same way. Across the aisle sat a man named Todd Whitaker. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered and rigid in posture, he wore his irritation like a second skin. His expression stayed tight as passengers moved past, as though each one was an inconvenience. The corner of his mouth twitched when Ebony spoke. He gripped the armrest and adjusted himself sharply in his seat, muttering something under his breath that no one seemed to catch. His eyes, cold and unblinking, shifted back to the little girl with a stare that lingered too long. Just a few rows behind, another passenger had noticed him too. Logan Shaw, tall, lean, with the unmistakable posture of someone trained to remain alert even while sitting still. His gaze swept over the cabin as naturally as breathing. Though his demeanor was calm, there was something unmistakably sharp in the way his eyes registered detail. The restless tapping of a foot, the tense shoulders of a man simmering with unspoken anger. Logan said nothing, choosing instead to blend into the background like any other traveler settling in for the hours ahead. Yet inside, he logged the details, storing them the way one does when instinct whispers a warning. The hum of engines outside grew louder as the final passengers squeezed into their seats. A boy complained about not getting the window. A woman barked orders into her phone, and a flight attendant closed overhead compartments with a firm snap. Janice leaned closer to her daughter, flipping through an in-flight magazine and pointing out the colorful ads. Ebony giggled again, tapping the page with her crayon-stained fingers. It should have been ordinary, just another child thrilled by the adventure of flying. But Todd's reaction was anything but ordinary. His jaw worked as though chewing on bitterness. His nostrils flared. He muttered again, this time low but sharp enough that Ebony paused mid-laugh. Confusion flickered across her young face, and she turned toward her mother, as if silently asking whether she had done something wrong. Janice followed her gaze and caught Todd staring back, expression hard and unyielding. The seatbelt sign chimed overhead. Announcements rolled through the cabin, instructing passengers to buckle up, stow trays, and set devices to airplane mode. Most obeyed without a thought, tugging at belts and pulling their seats upright. But for Janice, there was no ignoring the unease that pressed against her chest. She tightened the belt across Ebony's lap and smoothed the girl's braids, hoping the reassurance in her touch would drown out the unspoken tension across the aisle. In those first minutes of the flight, no one knew how quickly things would escalate, or how one man's intolerance would ignite a confrontation that the entire plane would witness. What began as a look, an ordinary glance twisted into something darker, was already shifting the air inside the cabin. And as Todd leaned back, still staring at the child with an expression that didn't belong on a routine flight, his lips moved once more. The words were quiet, but not quiet enough. Ebony's eyes widened, her smile faltering. If you're new here, take a second to subscribe so you never miss these true human stories, and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how far our community stretches. Passengers settled, the cabin hushed, and the engines roared to life. The runway lights flickered past the windows as the plane gathered speed. Janice tried to distract her daughter with another story from the magazine, but Ebony kept sneaking nervous glances across the aisle. Todd's eyes hadn't moved, his lips curled, shaping a sentence meant only for the little girl. The hum of takeoff masked most sounds, but from where I sat, I caught it, the low, venomous mutter, and it wasn't the kind of thing any child should ever hear. Todd's stare hardened, his mouth twisting into words meant to wound, and Ebony's face drained of its joy. The plane steadied as it rose above the clouds, the city below shrinking into a quilt of streets and rooftops. Ebony pressed her forehead to the window, eyes shining. "Mama, the cars look like toys. Do you think we'll see mountains? I want to see the ones with snow on top." Her voice carried the thrill of a child stepping into a bigger world for the first time. Janice smiled softly, brushing her hand over Ebony's braids. "Yes, sweetheart. Seattle has mountains taller than anything you've seen. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll see them before we land." Ebony's excitement spilled out in more questions about the food, the city, and whether fish from the ocean would taste different than the fish sticks she loved back home. Each word was unfiltered joy, the kind that drew a few smiles from nearby passengers who found themselves entertained by her innocent wonder. But across the aisle, Todd's fingers drummed against his armrest, his jaw set tighter with every word Ebony spoke. He shifted in his seat, muttering just loud enough for those closest to hear. Loud kids. Parents never teach them to shut their mouths anymore. Janice froze, her stomach tightening. She turned her head just slightly, catching Todd's expression, tight-lipped, eyes narrowed, a glare that cut past her and landed directly on her daughter. For a second, her instinct told her to say something, but the cabin was full of strangers, and confrontation at 30,000 feet wasn't something she wanted. Instead, she rested a calming hand on Ebony's shoulder. "Maybe keep your voice down just a little, honey. Other people are trying to rest." Ebony nodded, lips pressed together, though the sparkle in her eyes dulled just slightly. She whispered instead, tugging gently on the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket. "Can we look at the pictures, Mama? Maybe they'll show the mountains." Todd exhaled heavily, as though even the sound of her whisper was an irritation. He picked up his plastic cup of coffee and gulped it down hard, the veins at his temple rising as he set the cup back on the tray with a sharp snap. A few rows back, Logan Shaw's eyes flickered toward the sound. He had been leaning back, appearing relaxed, with a sports magazine open across his lap, but every nerve in his body stayed alert. Years of training had carved a discipline into him. Never ignore small signs. He had noticed Todd since boarding, the stiff posture, the restless tapping, the too quick clench of his fists whenever the child's voice rose. Now he watched as Todd's knuckles whitened around the edge of the tray table, his chest rising and falling faster than normal. Logan didn't move, but he filed it away. The warning signs weren't loud, but they were there. Janice glanced at her daughter, determined to shield her from whatever ugliness was brewing just a few feet away. "Do you see this page?" she asked, flipping to a spread of colorful seafood dishes. "They say Seattle is famous for this. Maybe we'll try it." Ebony wrinkled her nose playfully. "That one looks slimy. I want pancakes instead." The corners of Janice's mouth lifted, grateful her daughter could still find laughter in the moment. But Todd's eyes slid back to the girl, his glare unwavering. His muttering continued, though now his words had a sharp edge. Disrespectful. No one teaches them manners anymore. Janice heard it, but she pretended she didn't. Years of navigating the world as a black mother had taught her that sometimes silence was a survival tool. Confrontation could escalate into something her daughter didn't deserve to witness. Still, her pulse quickened. She leaned closer to Ebony, kissing the side of her temple. "Don't worry about anyone else, sweetheart. You're doing just fine." Ebony smiled faintly, reassured by her mother's presence. But her small shoulders hunched inward, as though even at her age, she could feel the weight of being singled out for something she couldn't understand. The flight attendant's voice broke through the tension, cheerful but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our beverage service shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. She rolled a cart slowly down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. Janice asked for apple juice for Ebony, water for herself. The flight attendant handed over the cups with a warm smile. "Your braids are beautiful," she told the girl. Ebony's face lit up and she whispered a quiet thank you, clutching the cup like a prize. Todd, when asked, barked his order for another coffee, black, no sugar. His tone was curt, dismissive, and the attendant's brows lifted slightly before she turned away, unfazed but wary. Ebony sipped her juice, swinging her legs lightly, lost again in the comfort of her coloring book. She chose a bright crayon and began tracing the outline of a dolphin. For a moment, Janice let herself breathe. Maybe it would all pass without incident. Maybe the man's attitude was just irritation at traveling, nothing more. But Logan's eyes stayed on him. He had seen enough men like Todd before, men whose anger wasn't just about noise, but about difference. Anger like that had a way of breaking through masks. Todd set his coffee cup down, his movements jerky now, like his patience was thinning by the second. His gaze lingered on Ebony, as though every giggle, every innocent word, was an attack on him personally. The silence around him grew sharp, heavy. And then it came. Without warning, his palm slammed down against his tray table, rattling the plastic cup and jolting the seats nearby. The crack of it echoed through the cabin, snapping Ebony's head up, her crayon rolling to the floor. Her wide eyes froze, caught in his stare. The sound of that slam hung in the air, loud enough to hush even the children nearby. Ebony's small hands trembled over the coloring book, and all at once, every eye turned toward the man who had made the cabin shake. The echo of the slammed tray table had barely faded when Todd leaned across the aisle, his voice sharp enough to cut through the cabin's buzz. "Control your kid," he snapped at Janice, eyes locked on Ebony as though she were the source of every irritation in the world. Janice stiffened but kept her voice calm. "She isn't bothering anyone. She's just coloring." Todd's lip curled, his tone dripping with contempt. "You people always make excuses." The words weren't loud enough to reach the entire cabin, but those nearest froze, the meaning clear and unmistakable. Ebony's coloring book slid from her lap as she shrank closer to her mother, eyes wide with confusion. Her fingers gripped the fabric of Janice's sleeve, small knuckles whitening as if she could anchor herself against the sudden hostility aimed her way. Janice's heart pounded, but she steadied her breathing. Her daughter didn't need to see her flinch. "She's a child," she said softly, each word measured, each syllable meant to draw a boundary without fueling the fire. Todd only leaned back with a scoff, muttering something inaudible before tossing a glare at the girl again. His body shifted in restless agitation, the seatbelt strap cutting diagonally across his chest like it couldn't contain the fury coiled inside him. Logan Shaw had not missed a single movement. From a few rows back, he lowered his magazine to his lap, his eyes narrowing in focus. The tension in Todd's posture, the jerking motions, the deliberate targeting of the child, was familiar to him. He'd seen men like this in crowded streets overseas, men whose rage hunted for a target. His instincts whispered that the situation wasn't cooling, it was winding tighter, like a spring waiting to snap. Around them, the flight had fallen into that uneasy hush. Passengers adopt when they sense trouble, but hope to avoid involvement. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his glasses but saying nothing. A mother with a toddler hushed her child, pulling him closer, as if distance alone would protect them from the growing storm. A flight attendant approached, her smile polite but tentative. "Is everything all right here?" Her eyes flicked between Janice's tense shoulders and Todd's rigid frame. Janice opened her mouth to speak, but Todd cut her off. "Everything's fine, just trying to get some peace on this flight." His words came out sharp, edged with mock civility. The attendant lingered for a beat too long, her instincts tugging at her, but with no shouting and no outright confrontation, she moved on, offering drinks to another row. The tension remained behind her like a weight left unattended. Logan's jaw tightened. He thought to himself, sometimes authority looks away, hoping the storm passes, but storms don't pass when fed by hate. Janice smoothed Ebony's braids, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Just keep coloring. Don't worry about him." But her daughter's hand trembled too much to hold the crayon steady. The bright pink line she had started was now jagged across the dolphin's outline. It set the child's joy cracked by the ugliness of a stranger's words. Todd's eyes followed every small sound she made. The squeak of her shoes as she shifted in her seat, the soft hum of her voice as she tried to distract herself. It all seemed to ignite something in him. His fingers tapped, then clenched. He leaned forward, lips curling again into something between a smirk and a snarl. Another passenger across the aisle whispered, "Leave them alone," under his breath. Todd snapped his head toward him, glare sharp, but said nothing, yet choosing instead to redirect his scorn back onto the child. Janice fought the rising urge to stand and shout. She had learned long ago that showing anger could be twisted against her, that composure was its own kind of shield. But the knot in her chest grew tighter. No mother should have to sit still while her daughter's innocence was chipped away seat by seat. The seatbelt sign chimed again as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Drinks rattled in cups, bags shifted in overhead bins. Todd's coffee sloshed over the rim, splattering against the tray table. He muttered under his breath, wiping it with an exaggerated flick that only drew more attention. When the plane steadied, Janice guided Ebony back into her coloring book. "See, the dolphin just needs a little more pink. You're doing great." Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced the reassurance through. Todd leaned sideways, his elbow jutting into the aisle as Janice tried to distract her daughter. His glare lingered, full of unspoken contempt. Then, as Ebony reached for another crayon, he shifted suddenly, bumping her arm with his elbow. The jolt sent the crayon streaking across the page, ruining her picture. Ebony gasped, startled, looking up with wide eyes. "Apologize," Todd demanded, his voice low but forceful, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. Ebony's lips parted, but no words came. Todd's stare bore down on her, demanding a guilt that was never hers to carry. Janice's patience snapped, though her voice remained calm. She straightened in her seat, fixing Todd with steady eyes. "She didn't do anything. You bumped her." Todd's mouth twisted, his face darkening as though being challenged was more offensive than his own behavior. He leaned closer, words tumbling out between clenched teeth. "Don't tell me what I did. Always blaming someone else, always playing the victim." The last phrase dripped with venom, his eyes flicking toward Ebony as if she bore the weight of his contempt. Janice pulled her daughter closer, her hand protective over the small frame trembling beside her. "She's a child," she said again, firmer this time. Todd snorted, muttering slurs under his breath, just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. The sound was ugly, thick in the air, and the reaction around him was immediate. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth with her hand. A man 2 rows up turned in his seat, frowning. Whispers rippled through the cabin, passengers sensing the temperature rising, though no one dared to speak above a murmur. Ebony's eyes filled with tears. She leaned into her mother's chest, her voice no louder than a whisper. "What did I do wrong, Mama?" Janice's heart clenched at the question. She kissed her daughter's forehead, her lips trembling but her words steady. "Nothing, baby, you did nothing wrong." Logan Shaw had been sitting still long enough. From his vantage point a few rows back, he watched Todd's jaw clench, his hands curl into fists on the armrests. Logan's own jaw tightened in response, the rhythm of his breathing controlled but shallow. He had seen this posture before, in men seconds away from exploding. His instinct screamed that intervention was close, but timing mattered. If he moved too soon, it could escalate even faster. Still, his body leaned forward slightly, his weight shifting to the balls of his feet. He was seconds away. A flight attendant, alerted by the growing whispers, approached with a forced smile. "Is everything okay here?" Her voice was polite, but there was an edge of nervousness beneath it. Janice began to speak, but Todd cut in, his voice loud enough to draw more attention. "Everything's fine. Just dealing with a mother who can't control her kid." His tone carried the confidence of someone used to getting away with this kind of behavior. The attendant hesitated, then crouched slightly toward Janice's row. "If you'd like, we can move you and your daughter to another seat, somewhere more comfortable." Her offer was gentle, but Janice's eyes hardened. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "We're fine right here." She wasn't about to let her daughter think she had to shrink and move every time hate reared its head. She wasn't going to let Ebony believe her presence was the problem. The attendant's lips pressed into a line. She glanced between Janice's firm expression and Todd's scowl, then stood slowly, backing away to continue service, though her unease was plain. The atmosphere thickened with tension. A young man leaned toward his seatmate, whispering, "Did you hear what he said?" A mother 2 rows behind clutched her son's shoulder, muttering that she hoped it wouldn't turn worse. Janice stroked Ebony's arm, whispering reassurances, though she herself felt her pulse hammering. Her daughter's innocence was colliding with a hatred Janice had prayed she'd never have to explain at such a young age. Logan watched, each second winding the spring inside him tighter. His military training screamed, assess, control, act. He could feel every muscle in his body preparing for what seemed inevitable. Todd leaned back in his seat, but the scowl didn't leave his face. His muttering continued, a steady drip of disdain. Each glance he cast toward Ebony was sharp, deliberate, the kind that pierced even without words. Janice rubbed her daughter's hand, leaning in close. "Just keep coloring, sweetheart. Don't listen to him." But Ebony's crayons stayed untouched on the tray. Her small chest rose and fell too quickly, her eyes darting toward the man who seemed determined to make her existence miserable. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Whispers grew louder, but still no one stepped in. Authority had been asked, and authority had looked away. The engines droned, steady and indifferent, as if the sky outside were unaware of the ugliness festering inside the cabin. Then, in the fragile silence that followed, Ebony sneezed. It was soft, childlike, no louder than the coughs or sniffles that had filled the cabin since takeoff. Todd's head snapped around instantly, eyes blazing. He leaned forward, his voice slicing through the quiet. "Shut that brat up, now." The command cracked through the aisle like a whip, passengers freezing mid-breath as Ebony recoiled, her small body trembling under the weight of his fury. The cabin had fallen into uneasy silence after Todd's barked command. Passengers shifted, eyes darting, breaths held. Janice wrapped her arms protectively around Ebony, whispering soft words meant to shield her daughter from the ugliness spilling into their row. Ebony's little shoulders trembled, her eyes glistening with tears she tried to hold back. And then it happened. Without a word of warning, Todd lurched across the aisle. His arm shot out, his hand connecting hard against Ebony's small frame. The sound of the impact cracked through the cabin, sharp, unmistakable. Gasps erupted instantly. A woman clutched her chest. Someone cried out, "Oh my God!" A coffee cup toppled, spilling brown liquid across the tray. Every passenger within sight jerked toward the row, disbelief painted across their faces. Janice's scream tore through the air, raw and panicked. "Don't you touch my baby!" She pulled Ebony against her chest, the little girl's cries muffled against her mother's blouse. Her hand rubbed furiously across her daughter's back as if she could erase the sting of what had just happened. Todd's chest heaved, his face twisted with a smug defiance, as though striking a child had released some warped satisfaction. His eyes didn't hold shame, they burned with the arrogance of someone convinced he could get away with it. But the world around him was no longer the same. Logan Shaw was on his feet before most passengers had even processed what they'd seen. The magazine he'd been holding slid forgotten to the floor. His muscles coiled with the same precision they once had on missions where hesitation meant death. Adrenaline surged through his veins, not the frantic kind that made hands shake, but the controlled fire of a man trained to act with absolute clarity. Passengers turned, their voices overlapping in a rising storm. "Did he just hit her? That's a child. Call the flight attendant." Phones lifted, screens glowing as people began to record. Janice clutched Ebony tighter, tears streaking her face, fury breaking through her shock. "You don't touch her. You don't ever touch her." Her voice cracked under the weight of both fear and rage. Ebony's sobs shook through her body. She clung to her mother with tiny fists, confusion and terror mixing in her eyes. A moment ago, she had been coloring dolphins. Now she had learned that even on an airplane, even surrounded by strangers, hate could reach out and strike her. Logan moved. His steps were steady, deliberate, each one carrying him closer to the row where Todd sat. Years of combat had taught him to lock out distractions, the shouts, the gasps, the chaos. But what rooted him now wasn't military duty. It was something more primal. A man had laid hands on a child. That was all he needed to know. Naomi's voice slowed within the current of the moment. There are sights you never forget. A battlefield scar. The final look of a friend you couldn't save. And now, here in this narrow cabin, the sight of a grown man's hand against the fragile face of a little girl. No amount of training could make it less horrifying. Flight attendants scrambled down the aisle, their hands raised in frantic gestures, unsure whether to tend to the crying child or confront the aggressor. "Sir, sit down," one of them yelled, her voice cracking. Another reached for the intercom, words tumbling out to the captain about an emergency in the cabin. But Todd didn't back down. He glared at Janice, his voice low and venomous. "Teach your kid some respect." Gasps turned to shouts. A man in the row behind him yelled, "You're disgusting." Another passenger stood, fists clenched, though his wife tugged him back, whispering frantically for him not to interfere. Logan reached the aisle, his tall frame cutting through the tension like a blade. He stopped beside Todd's row, his shadow falling across the man still breathing heavily, still glaring at the weeping child he'd just struck. Todd turned, meeting eyes that no longer belonged to just another passenger. Logan's gaze was steady, sharp, unblinking, the gaze of someone who had stared down enemies in deserts and jungles, and who recognized the same twisted arrogance in front of him now. For a moment, time slowed. Todd's smirk faltered. He shifted back slightly in his seat, as though instinct recognized danger even before his mind did. Passengers fell silent, every eye locked on the confrontation. Even Ebony's sobs softened, muffled against her mother's chest, as though the room itself held its breath. Logan lowered his voice, but the steel in it carried through the aisle. He took one step closer, his presence towering. "Sit down, now." Todd's defiance wavered under the weight of the command, and for the first time since the flight began, it wasn't Ebony who looked afraid. The cabin froze around Logan's command, but Todd's sneer returned as quickly as it had slipped. He opened his mouth to retort, but he never got the chance. Logan moved, fast, controlled, with the fluid certainty of someone who had practiced 1,000 times what it meant to take control of a threat without hesitation. In one motion, he gripped Todd's forearm and shoulder, twisting him back into his seat. The movement was swift enough to catch Todd off guard, yet precise enough not to cause harm beyond restraint. Todd's tray clattered shut beneath the force, his coffee cup tumbling into the aisle. Gasps erupted again, followed by the telltale glow of phone screens. Passengers leaned into the aisles, filming, murmuring, whispering disbelief. "That guy's a SEAL, you can tell. Did you see how fast he moved? Oh my God, he hit a kid, now he's being held down." Todd twisted violently, his voice rising into a furious shout. "Get your hands off me, this is assault." His words devolved into a string of insults, some too crude to repeat, others barbed with racial hatred. Each one he spat only fueled the disgust of those watching. Ebony flinched at the volume, clinging tighter to her mother. Janice's eyes brimmed with tears, but now there was relief mixed in. Relief that someone strong, someone unafraid, had stepped between her daughter and the man who had dared to lay hands on her. Logan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the calm authority of someone who understood that true strength never shouted. "You're not touching her again." Todd jerked under the restraint, trying to throw his weight forward, but Logan's grip tightened. His movements were economical, exact, enough pressure to keep Todd pinned, not enough to injure. It was control, not vengeance. The kind of control forged in war zones where escalation could cost lives. Flight attendants rushed down the aisle, their faces pale, hands fluttering between Todd's row and Logan's towering presence. "Sir, please, what's going on?" one of them stammered, her voice cracking as she looked at the crying child clutched in Janice's arms. Another attendant pressed the intercom, her voice trembling as she called to the cockpit. "Captain, we have a situation." Passenger restraint needed. Passengers called out over each other, voices rising like a tide. "He hit a child. Don't let him go. That man saved her." The cabin became a chorus of accusation and defense, phones raised high to capture every moment. Todd roared, his face red, spittle at the corner of his mouth. "I'll sue every one of you. You think you can do this to me? You'll regret it." His feet kicked against the floor, but Logan shifted his weight, pressing him firmly back, his forearm pinning Todd against the seat. Naomi's reflection cut through the chaos. Some men train for war overseas. Others discover the battlefield is right in front of them, in an airplane aisle. Violence doesn't always come with uniforms or flags. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a stranger with too much hate in his chest and a child in his line of fire. Janice whispered into Ebony's ear, rocking her daughter gently, shielding her from the storm around them. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." Todd thrashed again, his voice straining above the noise. "I have rights." He spat the words with the desperate arrogance of someone who had always counted on intimidation to silence others. Logan's gaze didn't waver. He leaned down, his voice low but powerful, steady as stone. "And so does she." The words hung in the air, louder than any shout. For the first time, Todd faltered, the certainty on his face cracking under the weight of truth. The struggle in the aisle had transformed the atmosphere of the plane. Where moments before there had been restless chatter and the soft drone of passengers lost in their own routines, now every eye was fixed on the confrontation. Some passengers broke into applause, their voices carrying relief that someone had stepped in. "Hold him there," one man shouted from the back. A woman clapped, her voice trembling. "That little girl doesn't deserve this." But others leaned close to their seatmates, whispering sharp concerns. "He's making it worse. If he keeps holding him down, it could escalate. We're in the air, what if this gets out of control?" Fear threaded through their voices, the instinct to shrink back and hope trouble passed without them having to stand in its path. Janice bent her head low, shielding Ebony with her arms. The child sobbed quietly, the sound muffled against her mother's chest. Her small body shook with every breath, each tremor cutting into Janice's heart. She whispered reassurance again and again. You're safe, Mama's got you." Though she herself felt rattled by the sight of a grown man turning violence onto her child. Logan's grip never loosened. Todd writhed beneath his restraint, curses spilling from his mouth, threats tumbling into the air. But Logan's posture remained composed, his voice calm when he repeated, "You're not touching her again. Settle down." A flight attendant crouched near them, radio pressed against her lips. "Captain, the passenger is being restrained. We need security at the gate." Her tone was shaky, but her words carried urgency. Another attendant moved to Logan's side, uncertain. "Sir, please, let's just calm everything down." Logan didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on Todd, scanning his movements the way a soldier scans the twitch of an enemy's hand. "Not until he's secured," Logan said flatly. His voice brooked no argument. The plane jolted suddenly, turbulence rolling through the cabin. Drinks rattled, bags thudded against the bins, and a collective gasp spread down the aisle. Todd seized the moment, jerking hard against Logan's hold. But Logan adjusted instantly, shifting his weight, pinning him back into the seat with one powerful motion. "Not happening," he muttered. The turbulence passed, but the unease lingered. Passengers clutched armrests, not sure if the shaking of the plane or the shaking of the human drama unnerved them more. Naomi's reflection carried over the stunned silence. Injustice thrives when the crowd stays quiet. When people turn their heads hoping tension fades, cruelty grows bold. It takes one person standing in the gap to break the silence, to say, "This stops here." Phones continued recording, the soft clicks and whispers of commentary circling the confrontation. Some passengers angled their cameras toward Janice, capturing her clutching Ebony's trembling frame. Others zoomed in on Todd, his face red, his mouth contorted as he spat insult after insult. The truth of the moment was being documented from every angle, evidence no denial could erase. Janice rocked her daughter gently, whispering against her braids. "Don't look, baby. Don't listen." But Ebony's small fingers clutched her blouse tighter, her sobs stuttering against her mother's heartbeat. The innocence she had carried onto this flight was slipping away, replaced with fear she would remember far longer than the trip itself. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. One of them leaned into the intercom, her voice steadying through sheer force of will. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are handling the situation." But her eyes betrayed doubt as they lingered on Logan, who remained immovable, his body a wall between Todd and everyone else. Todd's voice cracked with rage. "You think you can hold me here? You'll all regret this. I'll sue this airline. I'll sue him. I'll sue her." His arm jerked again, but Logan's hand pressed him down with silent authority. Whispers filled the rows. "He's dangerous. That man's a hero. Why isn't the captain doing something?" "Because we're in the air. What can he do?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, until the crackle of the intercom filled the cabin. The captain's voice, calm but grave, rolled over the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an onboard incident, we are diverting this flight." Gasps swept through the cabin as passengers realized their trip had been altered by one man's hate. The destination was no longer Seattle, it was whatever airport could meet them fastest. The captain's announcement settled over the cabin like a heavy shroud. Conversations rose at once. Questions, speculation, frustration, but beneath it all was the gnawing truth. One man's hatred had rerouted hundreds of lives in a single instant. Todd twisted under Logan's grip, his voice rasping with rage. "This is illegal. I'm the victim here. You're all gonna pay for this. Reverse discrimination, that's what this is. You can't treat me like this." His rant spilled out with venom, words designed to recast himself as the wronged party even as a sobbing child sat just feet away. Logan didn't flinch. His hands remained firm, his body locked in the posture of restraint. He had dealt with louder men in harsher places, men who screamed until their voices cracked, men who bluffed with threats that rang hollow when the weight of accountability closed in. "You're staying right here," Logan said evenly, his voice a steady anchor against the storm of Todd's outbursts. Around them, passengers murmured, their opinions split but their eyes unified on the same scene. Some muttered angrily, "Reverse discrimination? He hit a child." Others whispered fears of delays, missed connections, and ruined plans. But no one disputed what they had seen. A grown man's violence against a little girl. Janice held Ebony close, her hands trembling as she stroked her daughter's hair. She tried to shield her from the words Todd flung, but Ebony's wide eyes lifted to her mother's face, full of questions too heavy for her age. "Why does he hate me?" Ebony whispered, her voice cracked by fear and confusion. Janice's throat tightened. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. What answer could she give? That sometimes hate wasn't earned, it was inherited? That a child's laughter could draw cruelty simply because of the color of her skin? She kissed her daughter's forehead, swallowing the ache in her chest. "He doesn't matter, baby. You're loved. That's all that matters." But even as she said it, Janice knew the wound had already formed. Naomi's reflection drifted across the moment. What scars are carved into a child when her first taste of travel is violence? When the lesson she carries from soaring above the clouds is not wonder, but warning. Generations carry these marks. Mothers shielding daughters from blows and slurs, fathers teaching sons how to walk without raising suspicion. Hate carves deep, and it is always the children who carry the heaviest weight. The cabin rocked gently as the plane began its descent. The captain's voice returned. "We are preparing to land in Denver. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened." His tone was steady, but even through the intercom, the strain was clear. Todd's voice rose again, shrill with desperation. "I'll sue this airline. I'll have every one of you charged. You think you can humiliate me? I know my rights." His chest heaved, sweat beading along his forehead. Logan leaned down, his voice so calm it cut sharper than any shout. "You had your chance. You chose to put your hands on a child. That ends here." Todd bucked against the restraint, but Logan's arms didn't move. His control was measured, each movement precise, as though he were holding not just a man but a principle in place. That hate could rage, but it would not move unchecked. Passengers filmed, some narrating quietly into their cameras. "We're being diverted because of this guy. Yeah, he hit a little girl." Others spoke softly to one another. "Thank God that man stepped in. This could have gone so much worse. She's just a kid." Janice pressed her cheek against Ebony's head, whispering prayers only her daughter could hear. The child's sobs had softened to hiccups, but her body still trembled. Her innocence cracked in a way no mother ever wanted to witness. The city of Denver came into view below, lights flickering through the small oval windows as the plane cut through the night sky. Passengers peered out, whispering, watching as the landscape grew clearer, closer. The cabin felt suspended in anticipation, every second stretching, every heart braced for what awaited them on the ground. The landing gear dropped with a mechanical groan, the thud reverberating through the floor. The plane tilted slightly as it aligned with the runway. Conversations hushed. Even Todd's shouting quieted, replaced with a heavy breathing, his chest rising and falling in erratic rhythm. And then, as the plane neared the ground, the view out the windows sharpened. Blue and red lights pulsed along the tarmac, flashing across faces pressed to the glass. Police cars lined the runway, a wall of authority waiting at the gate. The wheels screeched against the asphalt, sparks of friction rising, but all eyes stayed fixed on the flashing lights that promised a reckoning the moment the plane came to a halt. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the engines winding down into a tense hum. Every passenger sat rigid, waiting. The cabin doors hissed open, and in seconds, uniformed officers poured inside. Their boots clattered against the narrow aisle, their expressions firm and unyielding. Todd's head snapped up at the sight, his voice rising in frantic protest. "This is a mistake. I'm the victim here. You're arresting the wrong man." His words spilled out in a torrent of hate and self-righteous fury, but his wrists were quickly seized and locked into metal cuffs. Gasps rippled through the cabin, followed by a wave of applause. Passengers clapped, some cheering outright, their voices echoing relief. "Get him out." Finally. He hit a child, and now he's facing it. The applause wasn't just for the arrest, it was for the sight of accountability catching up with arrogance. Todd twisted against the cuffs, still spitting venom. "Reverse discrimination. You'll all regret this. I know my rights." His shouts only fueled the clapping until it drowned him out. The rhythm of palms striking together became its own verdict, louder than any court ruling. Janice sat with Ebony pressed tightly to her chest. Her daughter's face was streaked with tears, her small hands gripping a doll she had pulled from her backpack the moment the officers boarded. Ebony's body trembled, but she clung to that doll like an anchor, her eyes darting nervously toward the man being hauled away. "Shh," Janice whispered, her hand smoothing over her daughter's hair. "You're safe, baby. You're safe now." But inside, her heart broke all over again. She had wanted this trip to be filled with laughter and discovery. Instead, her child's first memory of flight would be violence and fear. Passengers leaned into the aisle, offering words of comfort. "You're so strong. She's a beautiful girl. I'm sorry you went through that." Their voices wove around Janice and Ebony, small strands of kindness in a cabin still buzzing with shock. And then attention shifted to Logan. Applause swelled again, this time directed toward the tall man still standing steady in the aisle. Some passengers clapped him on the shoulder as the officers moved past. "You saved that child. Thank you for stepping in." A woman's voice trembled as she said, "You did what so many of us were too scared to do." Logan gave no speech, no acknowledgement beyond a brief nod. His calm expression didn't change, though his eyes lingered on Janice and Ebony. In that silent exchange was a promise, that stepping in hadn't been an act of heroism for applause, but simply what had to be done. The head flight attendant crouched near Janice. Her voice was heavy with regret. "I am so sorry. None of this should have happened." She glanced at Ebony, her own eyes misting. "We'll be filing an official report, and I'll make sure statements are taken. You won't be alone in this." Janice nodded, her throat tight, the words caught somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion. One officer approached her directly, pen and notepad in hand. "Ma'am, we'll need a statement from you once you've disembarked." His tone was professional, but gentle, his eyes softening as they shifted to the child curled into her mother's side. Janice agreed quietly, stroking Ebony's back. She knew this moment would follow them, long after the plane emptied. Logan reached into his pocket, pulling out a slim business card. He extended it to Janice without ceremony. "If you need anything, support, follow-up, even just someone to call, use this." His voice was low, calm. He didn't linger on the gesture, didn't wait for thanks, simply left the card in her hand, like an unspoken shield. Naomi's reflection threaded through the moment. A code of protection doesn't vanish when the uniform comes off. For some men, it becomes who they are, a quiet vow to stand between harm and the innocent. Logan Shaw carried that vow not as duty, but as instinct. As Todd was dragged down the aisle, still shouting, still twisting against the cuffs, passengers leaned back, letting the officers pass. His voice rose one last time. a final attempt to claim power in the face of defeat. "This isn't over," he bellowed, his words ricocheting through the cabin like a curse. The echo of his threat lingered long after he was gone, leaving the passengers staring at one another, wondering how far hate could reach beyond the walls of that plane. They thought they could strike down a child, but they struck a chord in all of us. That moment in the airplane aisle wasn't just about one man losing control. It was a reflection of something far larger. How quickly hate reveals itself when it feels unchecked, and how devastating it becomes when directed at the most innocent among us. A little girl boarded a flight with laughter, coloring books, and dreams of seeing mountains. She left with bruises not only on her skin, but on her heart. And every passenger who watched was reminded of the price of silence. Racism doesn't always enter a room with a shout. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, disguised as impatience, hidden behind complaints about noise, or muttered as just an opinion. But left unchallenged, it sharpens into something cruel. That day, it sharpened into a hand raised against a child. What struck hardest wasn't just the blow itself, it was the weight of history packed into it. Generations of families have whispered the same warnings to their children. Be careful. Stay quiet. Don't draw attention, because not everyone will see you as a child. Some will see you as a target. Ebony didn't understand why a stranger hated her, but she felt the sting of it all the same. And Janice, her mother, felt the heartbreak every parent knows, the agony of seeing your child wounded by a world you cannot fully protect them from. Yet amid the fear and the chaos, something else shone through. One man chose not to stay seated. One man chose not to look away. Logan Shaw didn't raise his voice, he didn't escalate with anger. He simply stood, used his strength, and made a line that hate could not cross again. That choice, the decision to intervene, is what turned a story of cruelty into a story of resistance. How many times in everyday life do we see injustice and convince ourselves it's not our place? On that plane, dozens of passengers heard the mutters, saw the glares, sensed the rising hostility, but only one acted before it turned into something worse. His intervention reminds us that the bystander's silence is often the greatest shield hate has. And breaking that silence is sometimes the most powerful weapon against it. For Ebony, the scar of that day may last longer than the flight itself. She may remember how her coloring book was ruined by a stranger's elbow, how laughter turned to fear, how even a sneeze drew rage. Those memories could have become the story of her first flight. But alongside them, she will also remember her mother's arms wrapped around her, shielding her with love. And she will remember the man who stood tall in the aisle and made it clear she mattered enough to defend. Hate may fly, but it never lands without consequence. Todd's arrogance ended in handcuffs, his threats dissolved under flashing lights, and the story that might have ended in silence instead became evidence that even in the confined space of an airplane, justice can find its way in. The lesson from that flight belongs to more than just its passengers. It belongs to all of us, because every day in classrooms, on sidewalks, in stores, and in offices, racism surfaces. Sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, sometimes shrugged off as not serious enough. But for the person on the receiving end, it always cuts deep. And for the children who experience it, it teaches them something about the world. Either that they are alone, or that someone will stand with them. So the question lingers, far beyond that cabin. When the moment comes, when silence feels safer than stepping forward, what choice will you make? Have you ever witnessed injustice and had to choose whether to act? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe no child should ever face violence or hate, like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. These stories are not just entertainment, they're reminders of who we are and who we should strive to be. One punch tried to silence her joy. But a Navy SEAL's courage reminded us, hate loses when good people stand.